It occurred to me years into this that right now, when we are still suffering, when the problem's not resolved, when it feels like our prayer's not answered in the way we wanted, if we're worshiping at that time, if we're grateful at that time, then we are actually worshiping God and not the result that He's giving us. And a lot of times I think in my earlier life, I would pray for something and it seemed like it was answered, and I'd thank God for the result and I'd be grateful for the result, but not necessarily grateful for who God was or his care. And so if you can worship in the middle of brokenness, you're definitely worshiping who He is and not the result that He's given you.
Do you ever wonder where God is at when life is flipped upside down? I'm Sherry, your host, and I created this podcast so that my guests and I could look at the good God we profess through the lens of pain and suffering. What I have learned both firsthand and through the personal stories of my guests is that the God of the Holy Bible speaks beautiful things in the dark. God invites us to give Him our pain because He's the only one who can transform the very thing that was meant to destroy us. Our challenge is to trust Him in the process so that we might come to understand who He really is versus who we think He should be. Listen in and discover the countless ways in which we can find God in our pain. My guest, Lori Ann Wood, has discovered so much beauty in the midst of pain and suffering. Hard-fought beauty as she sifted through layers of questions and gave God her deep heartache. And what she's discovered and shares here today is going to be gold for your heart. Lori Ann shares the journey she entered into when her life hit a major detour based on an unexpected diagnosis of heart failure. Married to her high school sweetheart and mother to 3 adult children, Lori's life was bustling with activity and health consciousness. However, a shocking diagnosis challenged her understanding of control, faith, and God's presence in suffering. Lori Ann candidly discusses the initial disbelief of her diagnosis and the silence from God that she experienced, comparing her questions and searching for understanding and the struggle with answered prayer to a spiritual wrestling match. Despite her pristine health metrics, she overlooked minor symptoms, not knowing these symptoms were pointing to her life-changing detour. Throughout the conversation, Lori Ann delves into the duality of grief and gratitude, acknowledging the coexistence of pain and thankfulness. She emphasizes the significance of lament in her faith journey, a practice she initially hesitated to embrace but found crucial for expressing her deepest fears and doubts to God. I especially loved when our conversation turned back to her book, Divine Detour, where she explores 3 pivotal questions inspired by Jesus' temptations in the desert. Is this life all there is? Is God always good? Is God's plan enough? These questions reflect her struggle with worry and doubt and control, ultimately leading her to a deeper relationship with God. You're going to be extravagantly blessed as you listen to this conversation and all that Lori has to share. In every one of her answers, she delivers beautiful insight with regard to God's heart for those who are suffering. If you're in a season of loss and uncertainty and you wonder where God is or does He even care about what's happening in your life, then make time to engage with every bit of Lori Ann's insight. The title of her book says it perfectly, Divine Detour, because when I think about it, when the unexpected throws a block into the road that we were happily headed down, I know that is the exact spot where the enemy wanted to or wants to destroy us, whether it's with a diagnosis, with a loss of any type, with no end in sight. There's that uncertainty with grief. But God, right? He enters with His love, His grace, and His mercy, and He turns our detour into something far more beautiful than what this life has to offer. If at all possible, get a pen and paper ready because you're going to want to capture and reread these distinctions and revelations that Lori Ann has to share. Let's listen in. When the people that we do life with, family, friends, loved ones, neighbors, coworkers, are in a season of painful loss, and that is a loss of any kind, not to mention the uncertainty that goes along with a life altering interruption. It can be hard to know how to help them or even care for them because that type of grief is as different as the person that it comes upon. Sealed with a Hug exists as the affordable, consistent, and effortless way to create ongoing support between those who are in a season of uncertainty and those who want to let them know that they're not alone in their pain. It is a monthly subscription box that focuses on caring for the griever in an intentional way without making any demands on them, and yet they get the clear message that you remember their pain and that it matters to you. The wait list is open, and there are a couple of more days left to get on it, and that way you'll be informed when the monthly membership becomes available. And from now until October 10th, those on the wait list will be given the opportunity to become a monthly member and activate the affordable, consistent, and effortless way to stay connected and show your support for those who are going through that season of loss and uncertainty. There are a limited number of boxes for the launch, and it is a first come, first serve. Visit sealedwithahug.com and join the wait list. Becoming a monthly member makes you the one who stays when everyone else has left. Lorianne, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Sherry. It's great to be here.
When I started the podcast, Finding God in Our Pain, I wanted to reveal the heart of God in the context of pain and suffering because I knew what God had done for me in my valley. And your personal story does exactly that. And I'm not happy about what you have endured. I'm happy that we get to hear your story, be encouraged by the way you have found insight and knowledge of God's heart in the midst of absolute uncertainty. So thank you for your, and I call it extravagant kindness in exposing your personal pain so that others will hear an example of God's power in our weakness. Can you start us off by giving us a glimpse of your life prior to your diagnosis? You're married, children, pets. What was life like?
Sure. So I'm married to my high school sweetheart, and I chased him all the way through graduate school. And then we have three adult children. At the time of my diagnosis, I had a senior, my last one was a senior in high school. So I still was doing the mom stuff and the senior stuff, and it was a busy season. I was teaching at the college level. I have an accounting degree, so I've taught business classes at the college level for 25 years. And I was just doing all of that, wondering what was going to be next after this last child flew the coop, but wasn't quite certain about how that was all going to pan out. But I was healthy. I had all the good numbers. In fact, the funny thing was, 3 weeks before my diagnosis, I had a life insurance evaluation to see if I could get preferred life insurance. And they did a medical exam of me, and they told me at that exam that I had less than 3% chance of ever developing heart disease in my lifetime. And I wasn't that surprised because I've always had, low blood pressure and low cholesterol, and I've been always been active and just good numbers all around. And so I thought, well, that, there was no history in my family of heart disease. So I thought, okay, that sounds right. And really, cancer, car wrecks, things like that concerned me, but heart disease never did. And I just I was very busy and very intentional and healthy.
I feel like that God really gave you a curveball then because, or did he do anything to prepare you?
I look back, and the doctor that initially diagnosed my heart condition is our family doctor. I mean, he had delivered our babies and done everything for us, and he felt horrible. He later told me, he said that was the worst day of his professional career when he found that. And I looked back and I thought, but I wasn't really sharing 100% in those. When they say, "Are you exercising?" Oh, yeah, yeah, I'm exercising. All the things. And I wasn't really telling him about the shortness of breath I was having. I wasn't telling him about the fact that I couldn't keep up with my family on any kind of incline and the fatigue that I was having because I thought they just sounded so insignificant. And I thought, I'm just going to hit the high points in this doctor's appointment. I'm not going to get into the little, things that sound like I'm just complaining. And I was getting older, so I didn't know. And I wasn't really sharing 100% with him. So part of that is I should have known, and I just didn't know the symptoms were heart related.
Well, I mean, when I hear you say that, I kind of think about, I mean, they sound minor. I probably would
Hmm.
have graded them as minor and
Hmm.
not thought anything of it.
Right. Right. Especially when you have, all the good numbers because they always check your blood pressure and your cholesterol. Oh, you're great. You look great. And you think, well, then I'm great, you
Yeah.
know? So,
Well, one of the things in your book, and I love your book, so
oh,
and I
thank
haven't
you.
finished reading it yet. 40 days of these little vignettes, if you will, where you share your story. Really your childhood story is wrapped all into it as well, and these examples of how God has met you in certain places and revealed himself to you. But you did something that I tread lightly around and give a fearful side eye to. You were praying and asking God to make your life matter in his kingdom. And you vowed that you would do anything to that end. The thought of that terrifies me because I do not think I have what it takes. Because let's be honest, God's ways are not our ways. And that includes how he chooses to reveal the magnificence of his beauty in the world
Mhm.
around us. To me, that is your mouth professing to the Lord what your heart believes. What about your mind though? Like your heart
Mhm.
is in it, but what about your mind? How much convincing, if any, did that take?
Sure. I think I was at a point right then. Like I said before, I knew that my last child was about to leave the nest, and I felt this big life shift coming. And I thought, this is my chance to really do something of significance. I don't know what it is. And honestly, I had all these things lined up that I thought. I was working with CASA. I was trying to be a court mediator, and I can't tell you how many doors slammed in my face when I was trying to pursue those. And I thought, wow, okay, so that's not it. And then I get this diagnosis, and, you know, I think the diagnosis itself was a shock, but it was how we learned to live through it that was really the story, and how I learned to hang on to my faith, because I had this faith that I had received from my parents, and I've known about God all my life. I don't remember ever thinking, oh, there's a God. I just knew it. And it kind of, the rubber hit the road when all of this bad diagnosis landed in my lap. And I knew I had to make a choice. I'm either going to go through this with him or I'm going to go through it on my own. But when I looked around, I realized that that's really the choice. You're going to go through the hard times, whether you go with God or you go by yourself, because no one's protected. And I thought, well, I'm going to hang on to him because that's what I know. And I have too much history with him to just let him go at this point.
And there's a lot of uncertainty, well, not only with your diagnosis, but even today.
Hmm. Yes, in fact, I had a stroke in February, and that was after the book was published. And as it turns out, as we're recording this next week, I'm headed to Cleveland Clinic, and they're going to evaluate me to potentially put me on the heart transplant list. And so that's just a lot of, I don't know. I mean, it's a good thing, but it's also a thing where it's a lot of uncertainty walking through.
To live in such suspension of how life is supposed to turn out, we think we have a normal way of planning and putting ourselves in the future, but of course, none of us have any guarantee for that. One of your chapters was about grief and gratitude. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? It's like this push and pull kind of thing.
Yes. I think so many times maybe in faith especially, we feel like we have to have one or the other. We have to have grief or we can be living in gratitude. But at the same time, what happens when we find ourselves with grief and gratitude in both hands? And that's true whether you have doubt and faith, you can have both of those at the same time. And they enhance each other because when I was feeling this grief that I don't have the life that I wanted. I don't have the capabilities that I wanted. I'm not the mother that I expected to be right now or the grandmother I expected to be right now. There's grief in that, but there's also gratitude that that opportunity even exists at all. And so I think anytime we're grieving, there's something to be grateful for because there's a source of that pain. And if we can look deep enough into that, we can find the gratitude. And it's not going to erase the grief, but it helps you carry it. And I think that's maybe an important lesson about this illness that I have is a chronic illness. And I don't think before that I even knew what a chronic illness was. I thought, okay, you either get an illness that's treatable or an injury and the doctor fixes it, or you have a terminal illness and you pass away. But to have something that you carry throughout your life, I had no experience with that, and I didn't know anyone who had experience with that. But I realized later that that's really a big life lesson because there are so many things in life that can't be fixed. They can only be carried. And, whether that's grief or, some certain disappointments that we have, sometimes we can't fix them this side of heaven and we have to carry them. And that's what this chronic illness has helped me realize I needed to do, was to find a way to carry it instead of fix it, which is what I wanted to do originally, was just fix it.
And so when you think about carrying it, because I'm trying to make sense of that myself, you can't ignore it. You can't get around it. You can't fix it. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care, who you have connections with. And if the one who can change it isn't changing it and he's walking it out with you to
Mm-hmm.
carry it, that could be pretty heavy. So having gratitude does sound like it would offset some
Mm-hmm.
of the pain of that. Not all of it.
But it's hard to get there. I mean, it's not something that I just woke up one day and said, I'm going to be grateful. It's a, you got to fight through it. And it's not an easy thing. But the thing I found was that when you have this thing you're carrying and it's not getting better and it seems like God's not doing anything about it, you keep coming to him and you keep asking him, and that repeated asking and speaking to him is starting to form this relationship when you're not even noticing it, and you're starting to rely on him. And so underneath, you're building this foundation of faith and this relationship with God that you sort of snuck in the back door, or it did for me. Like, I was just getting up going, okay, God, you're going to do something about this, I know you are. And then when he didn't, I'd be like, why not? What a great example it would be if you did. And so it became this conversation that I wouldn't have had if he had just immediately fixed it and I'd gone on my way. I wouldn't have had that repeated conversation with him.
I do agree with you on that in the sense that after my husband passed away and I was going through the grief journey grief with the Lord, that I realized then I had rushed so many things through my life. Like Lord, I just prayed away, I break it off, fix this, do that, that I did miss the beauty of who he is in the context of pain and suffering. Like
Right.
I rushed through it. I didn't want to be whatever I was struggling with, but nothing compared to that valley of losing my husband. And when they say be still, I had no choice. I was just done. Like
Mm-hmm.
out. So, but also in that, I say now that God speaks beautiful things in the dark because that's what he did for me. Is there anything that stands out for you that was beautiful as he walks with you?
I it occurred to me years into this that right now, when we are still suffering, when the problem's not resolved, when it feels like our prayer's not answered in the way we wanted, if we're worshiping at that time, if we're grateful at that time, then we are actually worshiping God and not the result that He's giving us. And a lot of times, I think in my earlier life, I would pray for something and it seemed like it was answered, and I'd thank God for the result and I'd be grateful for the result, but not necessarily grateful for who God was or His care. And so, if you can worship in the middle of brokenness, you're definitely worshiping who he is and not the result that he's given you.
Ah, what a beautiful distinction. I love that because it's true. When I think about crying out to the Lord and waiting on him to do things, what do you think people really need to know from God?
Well, one of the things that I realized was that the silence that I felt like I was getting back from God was that was just deafening to me. It was probably one of the most painful things because I felt like I was keeping up my end of the bargain. I'm back, God, I'm talking to you. And it was like he was nowhere to be seen. In fact, there was a friend of ours, and I had a prayer chain that was praying for me around the clock. And I had a friend from our church who said, God has to do something about this. There's too many people praying. And I thought, that seems like dangerous words. But that silence that continued just seemed so painful to me because God's a God that speaks, and I knew he was a God that speaks. We have his word, his written word, and so he's not a God that's at a loss for words. But sometimes when we're pursuing something, and it occurred to me that sometimes when we're praying for something, what we really need is a pause instead of the result. What we really need is that space in order to evaluate what's going on, establish how we feel with God, let him pour into us. And we need that more than we need the result that we're getting. And then, like we talked about before, that silent period is where I learned that some things aren't meant to fix. We just can't fix them, and that's okay because we're destined for a better place than this, where there and we know if everything fixed here, we'd be fine here. So,
I know the Lord spoke into my spirit too about, I was in pain about, the process, and I was mad and kind of poured out anger a lot of times. But he didn't answer. It was very quiet. And I'm sure it's because I wanted an argument and he wasn't going to argue with me. It was in hindsight that I looked back and I thought, the Lord knew what I really wanted, and that was to have my husband back, but that wasn't going to happen. But he is willing to sit in that tension with you, this place where nothing is making sense. He's not giving you the answers that you want, or responding with something to, to give you a heads up. And for me, I was struggling for control with him. And so there's still the kindness that he doesn't want to argue with me, that he wasn't going to give me another rabbit trail to run down. Because really, anything he would have said, I would have grabbed a hold of that. That would have been the next thing that I was, holding on to, and very much pain driven in that conversation. But long-term suffering can lead, in my opinion, lead to despair and depression, among other serious things. How do you keep from making that, giving it a home? Is it that you continually make a choice for gratitude? Choice seems to be so core, and a lot of being able to transition and turn from painful things.
Right. I totally agree. And I think what choice is certainly something that I did initially because I got to a point where I was afraid that I was going to lose my faith. I had put my faith on a shelf because my life was not making sense. And I put that up there and I thought, I'm going to get it down when I can make sense of life again because I want to pass that faith down to my kids. And if I break it now, I can't pass it down. And so I was very protective of that. And but I also needed to make a choice because I couldn't have it both ways. And so when I decided to get that down and wrestle with it and ask God those hard questions and contend with him, I realized, like you said, that he didn't run away. He was there. And I felt that. And you start to feel that presence when you make that choice over and over again. I think you start to feel, my husband and I still talk about this peace that passes understanding. We didn't know what it was. We'd heard about it, but we had that. And, when they didn't think I would even leave the hospital when I was first hospitalized, we didn't feel despair. We just felt this peace. And that was something that we weren't expecting, but wow, that was something that we really needed. And another thing that popped into my mind is something my husband said early on, every person who prays for physical healing is someday going to get a no. And I think about Lazarus when he died the second time. I'm sure that people were praying like, I know you can do it. You did it before, God, save him. And he had to say no because everyone had to pass through that. And my husband said, as we were praying one day, he said, you know what? It feels like we're trading what we can't keep for something we can never lose. And I thought, that's so true because I can't keep my health. And if I focus on that, then I'm going to lose. But if I focus on this relationship with God, that's something I can never lose. And so if that's what I'm trading, then that's totally worth it.
Something that came to my mind as I was struggling with the Lord is that, when He promises to keep us safe, He promises to deliver us, safely and protect us. I had to understand that it doesn't necessarily mean or translate to this life like I want it to, but He will be proven faithful and true because He will deliver me unto heaven and eternity with Him. And that's the final say, if you will, that we make
Mhm.
it there safe and protected. And so that was
Yes.
hard because I wanted guarantees that I would get my yes when I prayed. Uh,
Yes.
and so I think that reminds me too that we go into this place, maybe this pause you're talking about of questioning God, but there's an element of engaging Him, even if it was to perceive God's presence. So we do need to engage Him. We know He's there. He promises to be there, but we need to engage Him. But what does that look like, I guess? Is it
Mhm.
mental, spiritual strength, a confidence? And if so, what does that look like?
Right. I think I had to sort of rewire my brain or unlearn some things because I was always, and I think a lot of people might be this way, where we feel like we need to always be joyful when we're talking about God or our faith. It needs to, have joy or choose joy. And that just felt so hollow to me. I was like, that's not working for me. And I started to do a little bit more digging, and I realized that so much of scripture is a different spiritual practice that we don't use very much anymore, or at least I haven't seen it, and that is the practice of lament. And so when I started looking at lament in scripture and so many faithful people that had lamented and how that helped their faith, I thought, now that's something that might be helpful. When I first started thinking about lament, it felt like when my mom would say, if you don't have something nice to say, then don't say anything at all. And I thought, that doesn't sound nice to talk to God like that. And so I kind of shied away from it because I thought, I don't want to be disrespectful and I don't want to, you know, give off that vibe, but also this is what I'm feeling. And I realized that lament is really, it's unique to believers because not only are we disappointed and hurt, we have this petition or this allegiance that's tied to him. And so we almost feel like this strand of betrayal in there. Like, whoops, where are you, God? You dropped the ball. You were supposed to be here. But when we reach out to him in the practice of lament, we're saying three things to him that you don't even realize you're saying at the time. But when you pray to him, even in lament, you're saying, God, I believe you exist because I'm talking to you now. I believe you're there. And you're also saying, I believe you're powerful because I wouldn't bring all of this to you if I didn't believe, I couldn't hold you accountable if I didn't believe you could change this. And then I believe you love me, or I wouldn't be pouring out my deepest, darkest thoughts because we don't do that with people we just met or people we don't know. We wait until we're around people that really love us. And so we're telling God when we lament, I believe you exist, I believe you're powerful, and I believe you love me. And that's what we need in those dark times. And that helps us bridge this reality that we're living with God's sovereignty. And so once I started looking at those different kinds of laments in scripture, it really, and at first I just read them. And then I started writing my own laments based on those scriptures. And that really helped me to get those hard feelings out there. And also, the structure of lament helps you sift down to praising God at the end, which is so hard when you start lamenting. You think, I'm never going to get there, but you eventually do.
I don't know that I would have thought about what you've just laid out as what I was going through, but I can completely connect with that because when I was crying out to the Lord, I did that because I knew He heard me. I knew He was present. I felt His presence, but He wasn't doing anything. And I was, well, in that moment, it doesn't feel like anything.
Hmm.
Hindsight, I saw so many beautiful things, but it did give me an opportunity to put my heart out there and then allow him the opportunity to speak his truth into what I was feeling, because I was discovering that I had a lot of lie-based ways of thinking. I was combining past traumas in this trauma, and he was trying to, gently sort through that with me. And so in that process of lamenting, because we are brokenhearted, but yet with hope because of who he is. That's what he offers us, his presence. And I've never heard God's audible word, but I get the best way to describe it is downloads
Hmm.
of what he's saying. But it does help dismantle, sort through, and find this place of peace. That peace that you were saying that surpasses understanding. I've never had as much peace in my life as I do now after going through that with him than I've ever had in my whole life. And that
Hmm.
was through that gate, that doorway of such grief and pain.
Right. And it's something you would never choose to walk through. If you had two doors there, you would never choose that door. But as you're going through it, if you can stay connected to God, you get to a place where you're like, wow, that's looking back, that was something I never would have gotten to aside from that. And that's where I was, is that because I think there was a point in time when I felt God was silent to me, and I kind of gave him the silent treatment back. It was like that teenager slamming the door and saying, I'm not going to talk to you because you're not doing what I want. And that silent time was that time where I put my faith on the shelf. And that was a risky place to be. And I finally, when I finally started talking to him, it was in the form of lament. I didn't know it at the time, but it was.
Mhm. And I've discovered that you can trust God with your pain because he
Mm,
won't use it against you.
that's right. That's right. And there's so many faithful examples in scripture of that where we see people lamenting and hurting and asking why, how long, where are you? And he doesn't condemn them and he doesn't turn from them. You know, a lot of those people we consider heroes of faith, and they're the ones that we're saying, God, I don't see you. I'm going through this and I don't know where you are. And so that's okay to say that.
One of the things I remember saying to God is, how will I ever trust you again? I feel like when I needed you, you did not show up. Now
Mm-hmm.
everything is up for grabs. Will
Mm-hmm.
you show up the next time I need you?
Mm-hmm.
How did you build trust again with the Lord?
Mm. You know, it took so many layers, I think. It was a choice that I really wanted to hold on to my faith. That was one of the layers, but also there were layers where, I didn't even want to go to church to be honest with you, because people, well-meaning people who had been praying for me, I didn't want to give them the bad news that it's not good news, and I felt like I was letting them down and putting their faith at risk. And I just didn't want that burden. And so that I knew I had to somewhat how make a shift in that. And so when I would go to my Bible and read it, even, it felt, I don't know any other word to say, but it just felt kind of too rich for me at the time. It was too direct or too rich or something. And it just didn't feel like it was reaching my heart. And so temporarily, I tiptoed into reading other people's words who had suffered, listening to podcasts of people who I felt like were understanding where I was. And through that, and even a very unusual one was Christian music could get into my heart when nothing else could. And so I always made sure I had that on the radio, and there would be a line in there that would just get in my head. And sometimes that was just that little thread that kept me hanging on. And so I was just continually looking for what thread can I hold on to just stay connected in some way. And sometimes that was people stopping by to pray with me or just to check on me. Sometimes that was the thread. But there were so many layers that just kept me in the game when it would just have been so easy to slip out, especially when you're saying, like, how can I trust you again? And it was kind of the stories of other people and their hope for me. They hoped for me when I didn't have any hope.
And that's a beautiful circle to have around you, and people will hold that space for you
Yes.
when you're looking for that. And Christian music was huge for me because I was really, especially in the very beginning, I was just dumbfounded at
Hmm.
how my husband and I even got here. It was fine one morning and gone by lunch. It was a strange journey, but nonetheless, it was people, praying, holding me up, if you will, Christian music. And I wasn't going to church. I wasn't reading my Bible at that. I just stopped because I felt overloaded by it. But,
Yes.
but backing up a little bit to a comment you made, it can feel very empty. I like when people get real about pain and suffering because it really doesn't help when it's not real.
Hmm. Exactly. And I think we get it, and we have a tendency to just, the mom in us wants to put a band-aid on it. So nobody has to look at the wound, and we'll just slap this happy, joyful band-aid over it. And we know that we eventually realize that band-aid has to come off and the wound has to get sunlight and air and room to breathe. And sometimes that room to breathe is just somebody sitting there with you, and saying, I don't know what to say. I have no idea what you're going through, but I'm sorry for you. And sometimes that was all it took to get me through the day.
Presence really is everything. So, like you're saying, go sit with a friend and let them cry, let them scream, let them, you know, f just process if you're capable of doing it. I do know that not everybody can carry that. I understand that. That's pretty hard. What made you feel most vulnerable, or what makes you feel most vulnerable?
I think probably when it's like I touched on before, when other people will pray for a specific result, and it makes me worried that their faith might be jeopardized if that specific result doesn't come about. Like, I have people praying that I will get a new heart. I don't know if that's God's plan, and it makes me feel vulnerable for them, that we've designed the parameters that God needs to work around. And that was something that kind of inched into my journey as well, is something that is like a prayer of relinquishment. And this is something that, and the Bible does say to pray without ceasing, and that this is not in contradiction to that, but it's when you get to a point where you feel like you're just bent in two over something. I have prayed myself to death over this, everyone else has prayed over it. And you can get to a point where you say, God, I'm giving this to you. I don't understand what's going on. I don't understand why you're not doing what I would like for you to do or what seems right for me for you to do. But I trust that you know more than I do, and I'm trusting you with the result of this. And when I stumbled onto that idea and thought, it feels like I'm giving it over to him instead of I'm giving up. Like, and it's not that I don't pray about it, it's that I pray about it in a different way. I pray about it that I want it done God's way and in his time, because even now as I think about getting on that heart transplant list, people are saying, "Oh, I hope you get a heart really fast." And that kind of was unsettling to me, because I thought, somebody has to die for me to get a new heart. And maybe they need more time. Maybe they haven't found God. Maybe they're waiting for a baby to be born. I don't know. I don't want to put that parameter on God and say, God, you're not answering my prayer because that this line I've drawn. And when I could give it over to him and say, and I think maybe I first realized this when my dad was on hospice. He had lung cancer, and he and I kind of struggled with our conditions together for a while. And he saw my heart improve, and I saw his cancer go into remission. So we knew God could do it again. And when he decided to go on hospice, my first thought was, "Oh no, we're gonna pray this. He can do it, Dad. We're gonna get rid of this cancer." And that was my first inclination, was this pit bull approach to, we're gonna pray this. And a couple weeks into that, I realized I needed to relinquish this to God because I don't want to spend the last weeks with my dad in this desperate, determined. I wanted more of a peace and and a comfort for my dad. And that helped me really realize the value of relinquishment and that peace in, okay, it's not going to end the way I want it to, but God still has it and he's still in control.
Mm. When I'm listening to you share that, it reminds me that even if your friend's prayers do not manifest as they are, pit bull praying for you to have this outcome, because there is an exchange for that, the weight that you're carrying over that as well. But it does sound like there's this invitation for them to engage the heart of God about why he wouldn't answer, why he didn't answer, why not this way, or whatever it comes out. If it is not like you're saying, if he doesn't answer the way that they're praying, how will that affect their faith?
Hmm.
But to me, there's this invitation for them to now dive into the heart of God to find out, who he is in that context of how their prayers ended up, or how they did not receive what they were praying for. So I think that's really a beautiful invitation as well, even on their side. I might be putting words in your mouth, but
No,
anyway.
that's very true. And one of the benefits of that when I was praying that relinquishment and I'm like, God, you're not going to fix this the way I had hoped or envisioned, but I trust you. There was this, I don't know how to describe it other than to say it was a relief from the burden of the result. I had this, and it was a burden to me, like, oh, I hope this comes out the way I want it to. And when I gave it to God and said, it's okay, I still am going to follow you. I'm still going to trust you if it doesn't end up the way I want it to. I just felt this relief. Like my faith does not hinge on how this prayer is answered. And that was just a beautiful, similar to the way when I realized I was praying for a result and not, praying to God as for his character. It was that same relief, like, okay, I can exist within this realm and God still has me and I still have my faith.
That's the way the word says the truth will set you free.
Mm.
That's that freedom. And that's also the peace that surpasses human understanding. And that's what God offers us, especially, I think, in very heavy, heavy circumstances.
Yes.
Thinking about the way that you are worried about other people's prayers might be impacted by the way God decides to answer. If you could sit down with any of these friends over a cup of coffee, what would you want them to know?
I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier is that when we're trying, especially when we're praying for someone else, it feels like that the specific thing we're praying for, and often it's a health issue, that is their highest need and their highest desire. And I think I would sit down and say, it's hard to know when you're not in that, but somewhere along the line that didn't become my highest desire. My highest desire is just to have this connection to God and this deep connection that I know is going to surpass anything that I face on this earth and this body, whether it leaves in the next year or, I have 20 more years, it's the same. My highest desire is always going to be this relationship with God. And so that's something that they're praying for that they may not see as happening, but it is happening.
Mm, it's a beautiful thing.
Hmm.
So, we're talking about your book, Divine Detour, Turning Grief into Grace. And one of the chapters that caught my eye, so I needed to know a little bit more because I haven't had a chance to read this one, was chapter 19, Mosquitoes, Martians, and a Trustworthy God. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, that was one. It came about in because of a camp that I was at as a child, and there were mosquitoes at that camp, and I was just wanting to go so bad to my older siblings had gone, so I had looked forward to it. And when I got there, they took all of the kids to a movie that night, and this was a long time ago. Basically, the premise of the movie was these aliens came to Earth and they kidnapped the adults and they put mind crystals, they took out their brain and put mind crystals in them so they could control them. And the only way that kids knew whether the adults were regular adults or the mind crystal adults was there was a red dot on the back of their neck where they did the exchange. And after that movie, with all the mosquito bites, red dots everywhere, I would feel like there was an untrustworthy member of the adult group at camp, and I'd be like looking at the back of their neck, wondering if they. And I realized that sometimes the connection with God there is that sometimes we feel like He's not trustworthy, but in reality, what's happening is that free will, which was what the mind crystals took away, is the free will that we have sometimes draws us away from what God has for us and what his trustworthiness might look like.
I know I've done that many times in my life, so I can testify to questioning God's trustworthiness. When I think about identity, the power and strength of a solid identity in Christ, how can suffering, especially in uncertainty, grow us in our identity?
I think often about Jesus suffering on the cross and what that gives us in terms of how to suffer well, because he lamented on the cross. He suffered, and he asked for the cup to pass from him, and it didn't. He didn't get the answer he wanted, and yet he was faithful to the end. And I think that example of how to suffer well, hopefully none of us have to suffer to that extreme, but that gives us a picture or a framework of, God's not going to turn from us if we question, if we call out to him, if we ask for a different way. And that to me has been comforting throughout.
I will say it grew intimacy with Christ. I had intimacy with Christ. I really wouldn't have said I was missing anything, but boy,
Right.
in comparison, this went much deeper intimacy.
Right. And I think that's by joining in his suffering, we get that intimacy. You get that.
How do you make a connection with joining Christ in his sufferings? Like, what does that mean to you? What stands out for you about being able to share in that?
I think for me, and maybe for a lot of people who have a chronic illness or a chronic concern with God that feels like you've been praying for it forever and it's never answered, is that I feel like I'm still connected to God in the way that Jesus was connected through everything he went through. And you think about that journey that he was on. It's something that to a lesser extent, maybe all of us go through as human beings on the earth. But that journey that he went on was an example and a framework for how we can go through that with God and still stay with him. And God will be with us as he was with Jesus. And to me, that just gives me hope that, I'm not in this alone, because I think a lot of times, and I know you've talked about this, is when you're suffering, it feels like you're alone. It's like no one understands this. I didn't know anyone who had heart disease. I certainly didn't know anyone who had heart failure. And I still have people who don't understand what that's like. And because it's considered to be like an invisible illness for the most part, because you look fine, you look healthy, and I'll have a lot of people will say, "Well, you look great." And then they'll wonder why I don't show up for something and well, I heard someone say one time, which seems so appropriate. They said, in a lot of times people who have invisible illness are accused of pretending that they're ill. And really what they are is pretending that they're well
Mm.
in a well world. And I related to that so much. And I think even with grief, you feel like you have to function in this world that's not grieving. They're going on with their lives. And you may be pretending at some level to just like, I can function in this world. I still can. And I still feel that. And it's been 10 years that I've been trying to juggle this. So you still feel that, like, but that is a little bit of a taste, as so many other things, of there'll be a better world, a world where we don't have to carry that anymore. And that burden of carrying that reminds me that I have something better coming.
Mm, something we can look forward to for sure. You're in your book, you at first, I think you were going to do it in a chronological method of how you walk through your diagnosis and now your treatment and what's ahead. But then you decided to structure it around three questions. Can you
Mhm.
talk to us about that structure that you have now and why it's broken into these three questions?
Yes. So when I first started writing, I never really, I think a lot of people say this, I never really set out to write a book. My friend dropped off a little notebook in my hospital room when I was first hospitalized, and I think she meant for me to just write down notes for the doctor or prescriptions or something. What happened was, as the nurses were coming in throughout the night and waking me up, I would wake up and I'd be like, and I couldn't get these questions for God out of my head. Like, why am I still in here? What is up? What are you doing? Where did this come from? And I started writing them down, and I started keeping this journal. And a couple months into it, I thought, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to get healed, and I'm going to burn this journal. And it's going to be a very big day when I do that. Well, when nothing was happening, I kept writing. And eventually, I kind of went into that silent period with God, and I quit writing as well. And my husband said, "Are you still keeping a journal?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And he said, "You need to keep writing because God's up to something here." And so thankfully, I did go back and start writing. And that journal became this jumping off point for my writing. But I was just putting out these pieces that were kind of short, standalone pieces because that was all the attention span I had at the time. My mind was taken up with so much stress and worry that I would just write these pieces that you could read in maybe 10 minutes at a time. And I had so many of them, but I thought, what is this ever going to be? It makes no sense. And so I started putting them on little sticky notes. And I thought, what can this ever be? And at some point I was studying Jesus's detour, is what I call it, into the desert when he was tempted right before he began his public ministry. And I thought, that's a detour. He was ready to start what he came on earth to do. And God said, wait a minute, we're going to go to the desert for 40 days first. And when I looked at the three temptations that he had, I thought, those feel so familiar to me. And those are exactly where I'm coming from in these little pieces I'm writing. And so those became the jumping off point for the three questions in the book. They really inspired the three questions in the book. And the first question was when Jesus was asked to turn the stones to bread. And the question that came out of that for me was, is this life all there is? Because if this life is all there is, then sure, turn the stones to bread and take care of yourself at all cost. And so I started looking at that as a question of worry and looking at things like loss and uncertainty and fear and regret. And then the second temptation for Jesus when he was in the desert, and this is in the Matthew account, is when is what I call a question of doubt. And I was questioning, is God always good? But this is where the Satan told Jesus to throw himself down, and I'm sure the angels are going to catch you and you won't even get hurt. You won't even hit your head on a stone. And so I started looking at the idea of, if God loves me, will he protect me? And the vulnerability that I feel and the idols maybe that I'm forming. And so that became the second set of essays, was this question of doubt. Because, when they told Jesus to jump, what Satan was saying was, surely God loves you enough to not let you be harmed. And I felt that on some level. Doesn't God love me enough to heal me? And that's a big set of questions. And then the third question was Jesus's third temptation, where Satan says, if you'll bow down to all these kingdoms, everything can be yours. You can be in control. And maybe God's plan isn't that great of a plan. What about this plan? So that question of control for me became, is God's plan enough? Because God's plan to me looked like heart failure. And I thought, I don't know, this doesn't feel like enough for me. I want more than that. And so that became the third set of essays in the book, was a question of control.
Well, I think they hit on three problem points, three stressors for everyone who goes through anything that is painful.
Mm-hmm. I've always come to faith at an angle of questioning a little bit. And I know some people are different than that, but I've always come at it a little bit from that. And so these three questions always kind of nagged at the back of my mind. But when life was smooth, I could ignore the questions. But I think anytime you get knocked off your course and onto a detour, those questions are like, no, we are going to demand your attention. You have to address these questions. And maybe the spoiler is that they don't necessarily need to get answered. They just need to be addressed. They just need for you to be able to express what you're feeling within them. Not that they're going to come to a fine point and there's going to be a definitive answer on each one that you can really wrap your fingers around, but that you can express those and come to God and come deeper into a relationship with Him by asking those questions.
I know comfort, doubt, and control. That's huge for any individual to have to
Mm-hmm.
struggle with. But who better to struggle with it over being God, the one who can give you his presence? Because like you're saying, we don't always get nice, neat little answers to our hard questions. I often joke that the words of wisdom that have faithfully served me through the years is a song by the 80s rock band 38 Special, Hold On Loosely. And yet I do believe that it gives us room for God to move, to lead, and to transform. And I feel like that's what you're saying, hold on loosely. Do you have any particular thoughts about that?
I think that's so true because that goes back to what we were talking about when you're holding grief and gratitude, because you're holding something that you're so grateful for, but that grief is that looseness that you're letting it have room to breathe. And I think anytime that we can hold something and appreciate it, but also hold it in an open hand, knowing that it's really God's and it can leave at any time, that's when we have this life figured out a little bit more. Because I think my younger self was just holding on tightly. I thought the tighter I can hold, the more control I have, and the better life's going to be. And what God's shown me through this is that really, the looser you can hold, the better life is going to be, because that gives God room to work.
It really does.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about Women Heart.
Yes. So early in my diagnosis, I heard about this organization. It's called Women Heart, and it's the only organization that is designed to support women who are going through heart disease. They do a lot of advocacy for research and legislation, but one of their main arms is supporting women, and that sometimes is one-on-one or in groups, but it's supporting women who have heart disease or who are at risk of heart disease. And so I was interested in doing that because I didn't know anyone who had gone through what I was going through. And I thought, if I can use this to help someone else who's just as flabbergasted as I am, then that might be something to do with this. And so I was trained at Mayo and became a community educator for them. And I love their mission and the way that they reach out to people, because especially for women, heart disease is just something that feels so foreign, I think. And we just get in the middle of that, and it's often misdiagnosed, even for someone who does better than I do and shares all of the things to their doctors. There's a lot of people who are misdiagnosed. In fact, my mother, she ended up passing away from heart related issues the day that she went to see her cardiologist. She went home and died at home. And so, there's just a lot of things that present differently in women, and we just need more voices and more understanding in that area.
Mm. Definitely, because I know even signs of heart attacks are different.
Hmm.
A woman has different signs with regard to a heart attack that's happening.
Right.
Well, from chapter one, I mean, you opened up with something that was pretty powerful. You draw our attention to the fact that every life experience is a moment of pre tragedy and post tragedy. So there's a marker, this life marker of before and after. And to me, that immediately creates a knowledge that we're not alone in the suffering of life, health. And to me, knowing that you're not alone is probably one of the most powerful things I think that we can to know as human beings. And of course, ultimately that we're never alone because of who God is, who Jesus is to us. What a powerful tool that you have put in the hands of people who are living with loss and uncertainty, this space where nobody wants to be. And yet we find ourselves there at some point in our life.
Thank you. It means a lot.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to add to the conversation?
I think we've already touched on it, but I just want to reiterate that if you're in a point in life and faith where all you have are questions and you think, how did I get here? I felt in my life, how did I get to be this old and have all these faith questions? And I was embarrassed to have the questions. And I didn't ask them at first because I thought, how embarrassing to be this old and have all these questions. My faith should be rock solid. But I just want to encourage people that if you're at a place where you do have all those questions, that's a good thing because those questions are what's going to keep your faith alive. I think it was Frederick Buechner who said, doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. So if you're having questions, your faith is alive and active and you're in the game. And so look at that as a good thing.
I think anytime you're engaging relationship, you're growing, you're maturing, you're transforming with Christ, you're transforming. And so it is a good thing. I agree with you on that. And then the last thing, if our listeners only remember one thing, and maybe that's the thing you just shared, but what is the one thing you want them to remember?
I would say we serve a God who is desperate to keep the conversation going with us, however that looks. In some seasons of life, it'll seem like praise. In other seasons of life, it might be petitions. It might be relinquishment. It might be lament. But whatever it takes, he has gone to all these lengths throughout history to keep the conversation going. And our part is to just not let go. Find those threads that keep you connected to him.
Hmm. Well, we will part there because that's beautiful. Lorianne, thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your willingness to be so transparent.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you for your time and for sharing this experience with my guest. I hope you have found encouragement for today and a deeper revelation of God's heart in the midst of pain and suffering. We'd love to have you as a subscriber to Finding God in Our Pain so that you can be connected with all my guests as they share their personal experiences and professional knowledge about pain and suffering. And because this podcast is a division of the website A Life of Thrive, for more information and the various ways you can connect with us, please visit the website alifeofthrive.com. I look forward to sharing more transparent stories from the hearts of women who intimately know what it means to have their world flipped upside down, their authentic struggle to make sense of it, and what recovery and healing looks like. Till then, sweet woman, remember you are not alone and that God speaks the most beautiful things in the dark.